Ethan Carter had always been a man who avoided stirring up conflict. For nearly 15 years he had lived in the same modest home, keeping largely to himself while diligently tending to what was his. His residence was more than a shelter. It was a sanctuary painstakingly maintained over the years. Working as a mechanic, Ethan had developed a natural talent for repairing and reinforcing things, making them stronger and built to last. Every detail of his property, including the meticulously shaped hedges in his front yard, spoke to his commitment. Those hedges were not merely ornamental. They defined the boundary of his domain and symbolized the order and precision he brought to his life. He had planted them with his own hands, nurtured them through harsh winters and scorching summers alike, and pruned them with deliberate care. The living evidence of his patience and mastery over his environment had long been a comfort to him in a world that often felt chaotic. Then, one morning, Ethan awoke to find that his cherished hedges had been flattened. Initially, he assumed it was a mere accident, a driver misjudging a turn and inadvertently clipping the edge before speeding away. When the incident repeated a few days later, with tire marks gouging the soil, branches snapped, and entire segments of the hedge uprooted, Ethan realized the damage was deliberate. Someone was purposefully targeting his boundary, but for what reason? Determined to uncover the culprit, he altered his routine that following week, waking earlier and staying up later, vigilantly watching from his porch with a quiet intensity. Yet, no matter how alert he was, the vandalism continued whenever he wasn't watching. A late-night grocery run, or even a brief moment of distraction, meant another portion of his hedge would vanish. Conversations with his neighbors yielded little help. The residents across the street were too absorbed in their own affairs, or preferred not to get involved. Even Mrs. Hargrove, the elderly woman who usually sat on her front step, could only offer a resigned shake of her head and a remark that the miscreants arrived under the cover of darkness, moving quickly as if they feared being caught. Soon enough, Ethan began finding small fragments of plastic and metal among the broken branches. As someone who worked with machinery day in and day out, he recognized that the debris suggested a vehicle far heftier than a standard sedan was involved, one that had been deliberately plowing through his hedge with considerable force. Ethan approached the local planning board for assistance, only to be met with bureaucratic indifference and dismissive shrugs. One representative suggested, almost as an afterthought, that perhaps Ethan should simply consider repositioning his hedge. That comment sparked a revelation in Ethan. Someone intended for his barrier to disappear entirely. His hedge wasn't just an irritation to a reckless driver. It was a hindrance to an agenda he had no part in. Knowing when to adapt his strategy, Ethan set about fortifying his hedge. He reinforced its base by embedding steel rods into the soil and anchoring the roots with heavy stones hidden from plain sight. His modifications were subtle yet effective, designed to surprise anyone who dared to run through it again. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask for a favor. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and it's my absolute dream to once reach this. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. On to the story. That very night, after completing the reinforcements, Ethan retired to bed without keeping watch. However, sometime after midnight, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against a resistant surface roused him. Rushing to his front door, he discovered the tail lights of a black SUV fading away down the street, accompanied by fresh, deep tire marks and a fragment of shattered headlight casing lying on the ground. This time, Ethan had tangible evidence. Holding the headlight piece in his hand, he immediately recognized the model. It belonged not to an ordinary vehicle, but to an armored, custom-fitted SUV, one clearly owned by someone with both wealth and influential connections. The thought that such a vehicle would have any reason to trample through a suburban hedge in the dead of night set his mind racing. Without delay, Ethan made several discreet calls to friends who managed local auto repair shops. His suspicions were confirmed when one of them mentioned a customer earlier that morning seeking a replacement headlight for a black reinforced SUV. The man behind the inquiry was none other than Darren Ellis, a contractor with deep connections in local real estate developments. Darren, who had been quietly advocating for new road expansions that conveniently cut through Ethan's neighborhood, had now revealed his hand. It was clear that the repeated acts of vandalism were not random. They were calculated tests to force Ethan out of his own property. Ethan's response was as measured as it was resolute. He chose not to report the incidents or issue threats. Instead, he waited patiently, confident that if the perpetrators returned, he would be ready. To him, this struggle was no longer simply about a hedge. It had grown into a matter of control and personal dignity. He resolved that if they expected him to capitulate, they would soon learn how mistaken they were. In the following days, Ethan carried on with his routine outwardly, exchanging small pleasantries with his neighbors and continuing his work at the auto shop. Yet every night, he stayed up late, tools meticulously arranged on his workbench, mentally rehearsing every possible scenario. His intuition proved correct when, 3 nights later, around 2 a.m., he heard the low rumble of an engine. From behind the drawn blinds of his dim living room, he watched as the same black SUV approached slowly before hesitating momentarily, as if its driver were rethinking the move, then accelerating forward. This time, the impact was notably different. The reinforced hedge held its ground. There was no smooth, clean cut as before. The hidden steel and concrete barriers had done their job, causing the SUV to collide with a formidable, immovable force. The collision was accompanied by a disheartening crunch of twisted metal and a curse that shattered the stillness of the night. When Ethan stepped onto his porch, he observed Darren Ellis emerging unsteadily from the wrecked vehicle, clearly in pain and rage. A small duffel bag had spilled from the passenger seat, its contents, stacks of paperwork, documents, and what unmistakably resembled blueprints, scattered on the pavement. "Damn it," Darren muttered, as he kicked the damaged SUV. His fury was swiftly tempered by a flash of fear when he noticed Ethan standing silently on the porch, his head tilted slightly. "Having car trouble," Ethan remarked coolly. Darren's glare offered no answer as he fumbled with his phone, undoubtedly summoning assistance. Ethan let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of Darren's failure to register. He had been caught, not by the police or the media, but by the very man he presumed would be an easy mark. The next morning, Ethan awoke, replaying the previous night's events. The image of Darren Ellis beside his wrecked SUV seared into his memory. The damage to the vehicle was extensive. A crumpled hood, shattered headlight, and a leaking radiator all bore testimony to the violent encounter. Yet what troubled Ethan most was the duffel bag's contents. Years spent among construction workers and contractors had taught him to recognize blueprints immediately. These were no ordinary documents related to a routine road expansion. They were secret plans of a private nature, not meant for public eyes. Darren's desperate attempt to hide the papers only confirmed to Ethan that this was a matter far greater than a petty act of vandalism. Recognizing that involving the authorities would be futile, especially when men like Darren Ellis had the clout to ensure that any official complaint would vanish into bureaucratic oblivion, Ethan resolved to investigate on his own. His first step was gathering information. That afternoon, he made several inconspicuous phone calls to old contacts in the construction and land development sectors. Posing as a concerned citizen, he learned that rumors of a clandestine real estate deal had been circulating for some time. A major development project that had not yet been publicly announced. The only source of reliable details came from those closely connected with the contractors involved, and repeatedly one name surfaced: Ellis Properties, Darren Ellis's firm. Ethan slowly came to the realization that if Darren was aggressively pushing for this secret development, his property was viewed as an obstacle, likely the last remaining privately owned lot blocking a grand scheme. This explained the intimidation tactics. Initially, they had attempted to harass him into abandoning his land, and when that did not work, they escalated to actively damaging his property. Now, having inflicted physical costs upon them, Ethan allowed himself a bitter chuckle, confident that Darren was far from pleased with the turn of events. Late that afternoon, Ethan decided to take a drive to follow up on a detail he had noticed the previous night. Darren's immediate, furtive phone check after the collision. It was clear he had been texting someone, an indication that Darren was not acting on his own but was reporting to a higher authority. With that thought in mind, Ethan headed to a commercial district where Ellis Properties maintained a modest brick office building with tinted windows and a plainly displayed logo. Parking a few blocks away, he waited in his truck until he saw what remained of Darren's SUV parked in the lot behind the building. Not alone, either. A sleek black luxury sedan was parked nearby. Out of the sedan stepped a sharply dressed man in his mid-40s, his confident gait and guarded demeanor marking him as someone used to wielding authority without question. Though Ethan did not approach closely, the scene confirmed that Darren Ellis was not the mastermind, but rather a subordinate answering to someone larger. This individual did not merely desire Ethan's hedge to be removed, they wanted his entire property. A mixture of frustration and dangerous curiosity gripped Ethan. For the next few tense days, he maintained a low profile, wary of attracting attention while awaiting the next move from his unseen adversaries. Then, on a crisp Tuesday morning, an official-looking letter arrived in his mailbox bearing the return address of Ellis Properties. Ethan tore it open and read its contents, a buyout offer that was startlingly generous, far exceeding the actual market value of his property. Yet the tone was icy and laden with legal jargon, leaving no doubt that it was not a friendly invitation, but an ultimatum demanding his immediate departure. Setting the letter aside, Ethan felt his jaw tighten in resolve. The game was no longer one of polite negotiations. Later that evening, as he worked on an old carburetor in his garage, deliberate footsteps echoed outside, measured and purposeful, not the casual tread of a passer-by. Ethan dimmed the light and crept toward the garage door, his heart pounding. Moments later, a heavy thud struck the side of his house, then another closer to the front door. The intruder's actions were clearly premeditated. Gripping a crowbar, a relic of past experiences, Ethan edged toward the door until he cautiously cracked it open. In the darkness, he found a brick left on his porch with a handwritten note wrapped around it. The note bore only 6 terse words. "You should take the money, Carter." The message was unmistakable. They were issuing a final warning, asserting control. Clenching the note in his fist, Ethan stepped back inside, his determination solidifying. If they believed he would be intimidated, they were gravely mistaken. That night, with his front door securely locked and his senses heightened, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with a beer in hand, mulling over the gravity of the situation. He was well aware that the repeated destruction of his hedge had been only the beginning, the buyout letter merely a precursor to further intimidation. It was clear that his property, and by extension his independence, was the next target. The following morning, rather than overtly announcing his defenses, he discreetly reinforced his home. He replaced the screws in his doors with longer ones, bolstered the door frames, and recalibrated his outdoor motion sensors for greater sensitivity. A quick inspection of his garage revealed that although his tools were undisturbed, something felt amiss, as if the very air around him had shifted. His suspicions were confirmed when he discovered that the fuel line on his truck had been expertly slit, a precise cut that might have gone unnoticed until it was too late. The attack was not simply a financial maneuver, it was an assertion of power, a demonstration that his adversaries could reach into his life whenever they pleased. Having learned from years spent around men who employed ruthless tactics, Ethan knew that an impulsive, emotional response would only play into their hands. Instead, he resolved to draw them out and force them into making a mistake, all the while avoiding a direct emotional reaction that might jeopardize his position. Late that night, as he sat in his darkened living room, he watched the street intently. Shortly after midnight, a sleek black sedan pulled up a few houses down. The suited man inside stepped out with measured steps, clearly on a mission. Ethan allowed him to approach his porch, and after counting silently to 5, he opened the door. The visitor was tall, mid-40s, impeccably groomed with a sharp, cold gaze. With a courteous but unmistakable air of authority, the man greeted him. "Mr. Carter." Ethan replied coolly, "I don't believe we've met." The stranger chuckled softly and commented as he glanced around the interior of the house, "You're making this unnecessarily complicated. We extended you a very fair offer, yet you haven't responded." Ethan produced the crumpled note he had found and said, "Your message was received loud and clear." The man's smile widened ever so slightly. "That wasn't from me," he said evenly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you here? Is this just a friendly visit?" The man's tone shifted as he stated, "Consider this your final opportunity to accept the deal before matters become unpleasant." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You mean before you damage my property further?" The stranger's expression faltered for a moment, a subtle crack in his otherwise steely demeanor, before he recovered his composure. "No one desires chaos, Mr. Carter," he said. "But if you persist, you leave us no alternative." Without flinching, Ethan responded, "If you or anyone associated with you dares set foot on my property again, I won't be contacting lawyers or calling the police. I'll be prepared to take matters into my own hands." The suited man regarded him silently for a long moment, then sighed as he turned toward his waiting sedan. "I'm afraid that's too bad," he remarked, "but you were warned." As the sedan pulled away, Ethan examined the business card the man had left behind. There was no name, only a phone number. Over the next 2 days, an oppressive quiet settled over the neighborhood, an ominous sign that his adversaries were preparing their next move. On the 3rd day, Ethan discovered a grim message. A dead stray dog lay near his mailbox, its neck cruelly broken without any sign of struggle. A clear message intended to unsettle him. With a clenched fist, he buried the animal in his backyard, feeling the tension surge within him. That night, he turned off his porch light and lay in wait. At around 3 a.m., he heard the soft click of a lock being tampered with near the side of his house. Stealthily, Ethan slipped out the back door, moving silently toward his garage. From his concealed vantage point, he spied a young man, no older than his early 20s, dressed in all black, fiddling with the lock on his garage door. In a burst of controlled fury, Ethan charged forward and struck the intruder's knee with the crowbar, eliciting a strangled yell as the young man crumpled to the ground. Grabbing the assailant by the collar, Ethan dragged him into the garage and secured the door. Kneeling down with the crowbar gripped tightly, Ethan demanded, "Who sent you?" The young man, teeth clenched and voice trembling, remained silent at first. Pressing the cold metal against his throat, Ethan repeated, "Who sent you?" After a long, tense pause, the intruder finally gasped, "Sullivan." The single word sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Releasing the man, he ordered, "Get out of here, and tell Sullivan he's made a terrible mistake." The young man scrambled to his feet and limped away into the darkness, leaving Ethan standing alone in the garage, his knuckles white with the weight of the confrontation. This was no longer about money, it had become a declaration of war. The following morning, with grim determination, Ethan decided to take the offensive. He dialed the number on the business card without hesitation. After a couple of rings, a calm voice answered, not Sullivan's, but that of the suited man from the previous night. "Mr. Carter," the voice said smoothly, "I was hoping you would call." Ethan replied evenly, "We need to meet in person. Same location as before, around noon." Without another word, he hung up and spent the next few hours preparing himself mentally and physically. He was not going into this blind. He knew that men like these would try to bully him into a buyout, but he had no interest in selling his property. He wanted to see them forced to confront him. At exactly noon, Ethan drove into the parking lot behind the Ellis Properties office building. The black sedan was already waiting, with its heavily tinted windows hiding its occupant's expression. Exiting his truck, he found the suited man standing calmly. "I appreciate you coming, Mr. Carter," the man said. Ethan wasted no time. "I want to speak with Mr. Ellis." The man's smile was thin and unamused as he replied, "Mr. Ellis is a busy man." Ethan crossed his arms and said, "I've had enough of your people breaking into my garage and terrorizing me." For a brief moment, the suited man's features tightened, but he quickly recovered. "I'm sorry, but you're fighting a losing battle," he remarked. "No one is coming to your rescue. All you need to do to resolve this is to sign the papers." Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice. "Let me be clear. I do not scare easily. I refuse to take orders from men in suits who believe they own everything. And if you, Mr. Ellis, or anyone else sets foot on my property again, I won't be calling lawyers or the cops." The suited man sighed, almost disappointed, and then turned toward his sedan. "That's unfortunate," he said, "but consider this your final warning." Ethan watched as the sedan merged back into traffic, feeling that the confrontation was far from over. Later that night, while Ethan kept vigilant watch from his home, he noticed a large black truck idling at the far end of the street, its headlights off. His pulse quickened. This was not an ordinary threat, but a sign that his enemies were prepared to escalate. Grabbing his shotgun from behind the kitchen door, he stepped outside and fired a single warning shot into the air. The truck skidded to a halt, and after a brief pause, it reversed slowly and disappeared. Clutching the shotgun, Ethan felt a mix of anger and resolve. They had tried to run him down, but he would not allow them to intimidate him into submission. Fueled by the need for a counterattack, Ethan drove straight to City Hall. He didn't have direct evidence of the threats, but he possessed something far more powerful: documents. Requesting every public record related to Ellis Properties' recent projects, every permit, zoning change, and financial document filed in the last year, he pored over the records for hours. Deep among the bureaucratic paperwork, he discovered a document signed 6 months earlier that granted Ellis Properties the rights to develop commercial property on land that had not yet been sold, land that included his own property. The realization hit him hard. They had already claimed his land on paper, pushing the transaction through before even offering him a fair buyout. The vandalism, the intimidating letters, the physical sabotage, it had all been orchestrated because they were convinced of their victory. But now, Ethan held the evidence he needed. He immediately made copies of the document and sent them to the local newspaper, several city council members, and a lawyer who had previously dismissed his case. This wasn't just a personal battle anymore. It was a mission to expose their entire operation. Later that evening, as he sat on his porch with a beer in hand, he waited for the inevitable fallout. It came sooner than expected. A police cruiser pulled up, a stark contrast to the earlier vehicles. 2 officers emerged, one older with graying hair, and the other younger and more intense. The older officer addressed him. "Mr. Carter, we need to talk." Ethan set his beer aside calmly. "About what?" the officer asked, and after a measured pause, he replied, "Darren Ellis is missing." Ethan's calm remained unbroken as the younger officer added that there had been reports of a break-in at Darren's premises the previous night, with security footage wiped and witnesses noting someone in a truck resembling Ethan's. A slow smile crept onto Ethan's face as he realized that they were now attempting to frame him. "I was here all night," he said confidently, "and I've got security footage to prove it." The officers exchanged a look, and the older one finally closed his notepad. "Just don't leave town, Mr. Carter," he warned before departing. Ethan watched the cruiser's taillights fade into the distance. Darren Ellis's disappearance was a development he hadn't expected. It suggested that someone had taken drastic measures to cover their tracks, and now Ethan was the only loose end left. Realizing that the situation was spiraling, he knew he needed answers and leverage. By sunrise the next day, Ethan found himself parked outside the modest Ellis Properties office once more. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the sleek black sedan had vanished, suggesting that the suited man and his cohorts were lying low. Determined not to leave empty-handed, he strode into the building. At the reception desk, a weary woman in her mid-30s looked up with tired eyes and murmured, "You're not supposed to be here." Ethan responded with a polite smile. "Neither is your boss, I'm afraid." The woman's expression shifted. She hesitated before confiding softly, "They instructed me to keep my mouth shut." Drawing a chair closer, Ethan continued, "I don't care about the shady deals going on, but I know Darren was scared. He kept taking secret calls, locking his office, and mentioning a name, Langley." The receptionist shook her head. "I'm not sure who Langley is," she whispered, "but Darren often said he wouldn't let Langley push him out. That name suggests there's someone bigger at play." Before Ethan could ask further, the woman stiffened as a black SUV slowly pulled into the lot outside. "They're watching," she breathed. Nodding silently, Ethan left the building with a heavy heart and drove home while taking convoluted routes to avoid detection. For the next several days, no overt threats materialized. It was a deceptive calm, a lull before the coming storm. Ethan spent this time fortifying his home further, installing additional motion sensors and reinforcing every entry point. Then, on the fourth night, he detected a faint scraping sound near his garage, deliberate and unnerving. Clutching his shotgun, he crept toward the window and saw a shadowy figure near his truck, presumably attempting to tamper with the fuel line once more. Steeling himself, he flung open the garage door and shouted, "Make one move, and I'll put you down." The intruder, a young man in dark clothing and gloves with wide, frightened eyes, froze immediately. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and pressed the shotgun barrel to his chest. "Who sent you?" he demanded again in a low, steady tone. After a tense silence, the young man stammered, "They told me to cut the line. They mentioned the name Langley." With that, Ethan released him and ordered, "Get out and tell Langley he's made a grave mistake." The would-be saboteur bolted into the night, leaving Ethan to process the implications. Langley was not just a name, it was the architect behind these escalating measures. Realizing he needed more concrete evidence, Ethan began researching Langley's involvement in local property deals. His efforts uncovered that Langley was not only an investor, but also controlled multiple shell companies tied to lucrative city contracts, the same contracts Darren Ellis had been aggressively promoting. Langley had effectively replaced Darren, and now it was clear that he was orchestrating the entire campaign against Ethan's property. The revelation was a turning point. Ethan decided it was time to take decisive action. That evening, he reached out to an old friend known for handling situations with ruthless efficiency. The conversation over a burner phone was curt. "I need everything you can dig up on Langley," Ethan said, his tone edged with determination. After a brief pause, his friend replied, "There's an old project called Brookside Expansion from 5 years ago. A high-end residential development that mysteriously collapsed amid bribery, hush money, and unexplained disappearances. Langley's name was all over it." Ethan's mind raced. Brookside had been the talk of the town before vanishing into obscurity, and now it appeared that Langley had a history of eliminating obstacles. Armed with this clue, Ethan spent hours poring over city records related to Brookside. Permits had been filed and money exchanged, yet the project had simply evaporated, leaving behind a list of landowners who had sold their properties hastily. Among those names, Ethan's eyes locked onto Darren Ellis's, a clear sign that Darren had once been entangled in these dubious dealings and may have tried to extricate himself by selling out. Determined to uncover the full truth, Ethan made his way to Darren's former office building. Although the building was dark and locked, his expertise allowed him to pick the side door's lock quickly. Inside, the office was a mess. Desks upturned, filing cabinets emptied and documents strewn about in disarray. Amid the chaos, Ethan discovered a manila folder tucked away under a desk. Its contents were damning. Copies of internal emails, financial records, and a terse letter from Darren to Langley dated just 3 weeks earlier. In that letter, Darren had warned, "I know what you did with Brookside. Either include me in your next move or I go public." The discovery confirmed that Darren had grown greedy and rebellious, and that his fate was sealed when he challenged Langley. Before Ethan could process the implications, he heard a car door slam outside. Acting swiftly, he shoved the folder into his jacket and slipped out a back exit. Dodging through side corridors and empty parking lots, he managed to disappear into the night. Once safely home, he made copies of the documents and distributed them to the local newspaper, a trusted lawyer who had once dismissed his case, and an insurance contact. He reasoned that if anything were to happen to him, the truth would still be known. By morning, headlines blasted a massive land fraud scandal implicating Langley. City officials scrambled to distance themselves, and within hours, Langley's office was raided, resulting in his arrest. That very night, as Ethan sat on his porch with a beer and watched the sun dip below the horizon, a different vehicle pulled up, a police cruiser. 2 officers, one older and one younger, approached him. The older officer stated gravely, "Mr. Carter, Darren Ellis is missing." The younger officer added that eyewitnesses had seen someone lingering near Darren's location after hours in a truck suspiciously similar to Ethan's. Ethan calmly replied, "I was right here all night. I have security footage to prove it." The officers exchanged glances before the older one closed his notepad with a resigned sigh. "Just don't leave town," he cautioned as they departed. Ethan's mind raced as he considered the implications of Darren's disappearance. It wasn't simply a case of intimidation anymore. Someone was eliminating loose ends. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Ethan drove back to the Ellis Properties office the following morning. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the luxury sedan had vanished, indicating that the suited man was either in hiding or had fled. Undeterred, Ethan entered the building. At the reception desk, a tired receptionist in her 30s glanced up, surprised. "You're not supposed to be here," she muttered, but Ethan's calm reply, "Neither is your boss," prompted her to lower her voice. "They told me to keep quiet," she admitted. Leaning in, she confided that Darren had been anxious all week, taking secret calls and repeatedly mentioning someone named Sullivan. Ethan's curiosity deepened, but before he could press further, the receptionist's eyes widened as a black SUV crawled slowly into the lot. "They're watching," she whispered. A silent nod from Ethan, and he left without another word, driving home along a circuitous route to avoid detection. For the next several days, the silence was unnerving. No further overt threats or violent acts occurred. Ethan took advantage of the lull to further bolster his home's defenses, reinforcing doors, installing additional sensors, and ensuring that his truck was securely locked away in the garage. But the calm was deceptive. On the 4th night, he heard a distinct scraping sound at his garage door. Quietly, he reached for his shotgun and crept toward the window, where he saw a shadow near his truck, likely attempting to sabotage the fuel line once more. With no time to waste, he flung open the garage door and confronted the intruder. "Move and I'll drop you," Ethan warned sharply. The intruder, a young man with a look of sheer terror, froze immediately. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and, pressing the cold barrel of his shotgun against his chest, demanded, "Who sent you?" After a prolonged silence, the trembling young man managed to choke out, "Sullivan! They told me to cut the line!" Ethan's eyes burned with resolve as he released the terrified intruder. "Get out and tell Sullivan that he's made a huge mistake," he ordered. The youth bolted into the darkness, leaving Ethan alone with the painful truth that his battle had grown far larger than a simple land dispute. Realizing that he needed to turn the tables, Ethan began an exhaustive investigation into Sullivan's network. He discovered that Sullivan was not merely an investor, but the puppeteer behind a series of corrupt land deals, controlling multiple shell companies tied to city contracts, the very same contracts Darren Ellis had been pushing. It became evident that Darren had been nothing more than a pawn in Sullivan's grand scheme. With this realization, Ethan decided it was time to strike back. That night, he made another call to an old friend renowned for getting results without questions. When his friend answered, the voice was curt and businesslike. "I need every scrap of information you can find on Sullivan," Ethan demanded. After a brief pause, his contact replied, "Check out a project called Brookside Expansion from 5 years ago. A housing development that mysteriously collapsed after questionable deals and hush money. Sullivan's fingerprints are all over it." Ethan recalled that Brookside had been a high-end residential venture that vanished without a trace. As he sifted through city records, he found that while permits had been issued and funds exchanged, the project had simply evaporated, leaving behind only a list of landowners who had sold their properties prematurely. Among those names was Darren Ellis. It appeared Darren had once attempted to extricate himself from Sullivan's clutches by selling out, but this time he was fighting back. Determined to expose the corruption, Ethan made his way to Darren's abandoned office. The building, though dark and locked, yielded its secrets when Ethan quickly picked the side door's lock. Inside, chaos reigned. Desks were overturned, filing cabinets lay open, and papers were scattered. Yet amidst the disarray, Ethan uncovered a manila folder stuffed under a desk. Within it were internal emails, financial records, and a short biting letter from Darren to Sullivan dated 3 weeks prior. The letter read simply, "I know what you did with Brookside. Either include me in your next move, or I go public." This was the turning point. Darren had grown greedy and defiant, and his challenge to Sullivan had sealed his fate. Before Ethan could absorb the full impact, he heard the sound of a car door slam outside. Realizing that Sullivan's operatives were on the move, he quickly tucked the documents into his jacket and slipped out through a back exit. Navigating dark corridors and empty parking lots with practiced caution, he managed to elude pursuit and returned home, exhausted. Once safely inside, he scanned and copied the incriminating documents, then sent them simultaneously to the local news, his once dismissive lawyer, and a trusted insurance contact. His plan was simple. If anything happened to him, the truth would still emerge. By morning, headlines screamed of a massive land fraud scandal implicating Sullivan. City officials scrambled to distance themselves, and by midday, Sullivan's office was raided and the mastermind was taken into custody. That evening, as Ethan sat on his porch watching the sunset, his thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a police cruiser. Not the intimidating vehicles of his foes, but an official sign that the tide was turning. 2 officers, one with graying hair and one younger and more determined, approached him. The older officer stated calmly, "Mr. Carter, Darren Ellis is missing." The younger one added that surveillance footage showed someone lingering near Darren's property after hours in a vehicle similar to Ethan's. With quiet confidence, Ethan replied, "I was right here all night, and my security footage proves it." After a brief exchange of glances, the older officer closed his notepad and said, "Just don't leave town, Mr. Carter." As the cruiser faded away, Ethan knew that Darren's disappearance was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger scheme to eliminate loose ends, and now he was the only one left. Determined to expose every detail, Ethan returned to the Ellis Properties office once more. The parking lot was nearly deserted, and the luxury sedan was nowhere in sight. Inside, he found the receptionist again, who admitted in hushed tones that Darren had been unnerved all week, mentioning a name he couldn't fully explain. Sullivan. Before Ethan could press further, she whispered, "They're watching." Her words were accompanied by the sound of a black SUV slowly pulling into the lot. With a silent nod, Ethan left immediately, taking a convoluted route home to avoid any prying eyes. Over the next few days, nothing overtly violent occurred, a deceptive lull that gave Ethan time to reinforce his property further and maintain constant vigilance. Yet on the fourth night, as he lay awake listening to the faint, deliberate scraping at his garage door, he realized the enemy was preparing for a more direct assault. With his shotgun at the ready, he crept toward the source of the noise. In the dim light, he spotted a shadow near his truck, presumably attempting yet another act of sabotage. Without hesitation, he opened the garage door, stepping out and raising his weapon. "Move, and I drop you," he commanded. The intruder, a young man barely in his 20s, dressed in dark clothing and gloves, froze in terror. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and pressed the shotgun barrel to his chest, demanding once more, "Who sent you?" After a tense silence, the frightened youth managed to choke out, "Langley! They told me to sabotage your truck." Ethan's heart pounded as he released the man, warning, "Get out and tell Langley he's made a huge mistake." The youth bolted, leaving Ethan standing alone, realizing that his battle had now evolved into something far more dangerous, a war for control. Realizing that his next move had to be calculated and offensive, Ethan dedicated himself to uncovering every shred of evidence linking Sullivan's network to the fraudulent land deals. Hours of research revealed that Sullivan was the mastermind behind a web of shell companies and corrupt contracts, a network that extended far beyond Darren Ellis's isolated actions. This revelation filled Ethan with determination. That night, he called an old associate known for his discreet but effective work in exposing corruption. When the call connected, the associate's voice was low and unyielding. "I'll get you everything on Sullivan. Start with the Brookside expansion project from 5 years ago," he advised. Ethan recalled that Brookside had been a promising high-end housing development that inexplicably collapsed amid bribery and hush deals. Digging into the city records, Ethan uncovered a trail of permits, transactions, and a final list of landowners who had sold their lots under pressure, one of which was Darren Ellis's name. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align. Compelled to see the full extent of the conspiracy, Ethan returned to Darren's old office building one final time. The building, though ransacked, still harbored remnants of the truth. Amid overturned desks and scattered papers, he found a manila folder containing internal emails, financial documents, and a terse letter from Darren to Sullivan. In that letter, Darren had warned, "I know what you did with Brookside. Either cut me in or I go public." This undeniable evidence confirmed that Darren had once been complicit, but had chosen to rebel, and in doing so, had sealed his own fate. Before Ethan could finish processing this explosive information, the sound of heavy footsteps and a car door slamming echoed outside. Sensing that professional operatives were closing in, he hastily tucked the documents into his jacket and slipped out a back exit. Dodging through dim hallways and deserted parking areas, he managed to evade detection and return home safely. Exhausted, yet resolute, he scanned and copied the incriminating files, then sent them to the local press, his lawyer, and a trusted insurance contact, ensuring that if he were silenced, the truth would still prevail. By morning, news outlets were broadcasting a massive land fraud scandal implicating Sullivan and his cronies. In a dramatic turn of events, city officials distanced themselves, and within hours, Sullivan was arrested following a raid on his office. That night, as Ethan relaxed on his porch with a beer, the events of the past weeks began to settle into a hard-won clarity. A different vehicle approached, a police cruiser this time, and 2 officers stepped out. The older one, with a measured tone, informed him, "Mr. Carter, Darren Ellis is missing." The younger officer, eyes narrowed, mentioned that security cameras had captured suspicious activity near Darren's property, and that witnesses had seen someone in a truck, reminiscent of Ethan's. Ethan calmly set his beer down and replied, "I was here all night. My security footage can confirm that." The officers exchanged glances, and after a moment, the older officer closed his notepad. "Just stay in town, Mr. Carter," he advised before departing. Ethan realized that Darren's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger purge designed to eliminate anyone who could expose the corruption. With his property now marked as a battleground, Ethan resolved that he would no longer be a passive victim. At dawn, he parked outside the nearly empty Ellis Properties lot once more. The absence of the black sedan confirmed that the suited man was no longer in the area. Undeterred, Ethan marched into the building and approached the reception desk. The receptionist, looking even more wary than before, muttered, "You shouldn't be here." Ethan replied quietly, "Neither should your boss." The woman hesitated, then said, "They warned me to keep my mouth shut." Leaning in, she added, "Darren was terrified last week. He kept mentioning someone named Sullivan, claiming he wouldn't let Sullivan force him out." Before Ethan could ask further, she whispered, "They're watching." A black SUV had pulled into the lot, and her voice trembled with fear. With a curt nod, Ethan left the building, driving home along winding side streets to avoid detection. For several days after, nothing overtly violent occurred, a deceptive quiet that allowed Ethan to further prepare. He reinforced every door, installed extra sensors, and ensured that his truck remained hidden in the garage. Yet on the fourth night, a deliberate scraping sound at his garage door shattered the calm. Ethan, armed with his shotgun, crept toward the noise. In the dim light, he saw a shadow near his truck, likely attempting to sabotage the fuel line once more. Without delay, he opened the garage door and confronted the intruder. "Move and I'll drop you," he warned. The young man, clad in dark attire and gloves with wide, fearful eyes, froze immediately. Gripping him by the collar and pressing the shotgun barrel against his chest, Ethan demanded, "Who sent you?" After a moment of tense silence, the intruder choked out, "Langley. They told me to cut the line and leave." Ethan's resolve hardened as he released the trembling youth, instructing him, "Get out and tell Langley he's made a huge mistake." The intruder bolted into the darkness, and Ethan was left alone, realizing that his battle had escalated into full-blown warfare. Determined to turn the tables, Ethan spent the next several hours gathering every scrap of evidence linking Sullivan's network to fraudulent land deals. His research confirmed that Sullivan was the mastermind, pulling strings behind multiple shell companies and corrupt contracts, an intricate web designed to force property owners like him out. With irrefutable evidence in hand, Ethan arranged a meeting with an old ally known for his ability to uncover dirt on men like Sullivan without asking questions. At exactly noon the following day, Ethan arrived in the parking lot behind the modest Ellis Properties building. The black sedan was absent, and the suited man was nowhere in sight. The quiet was palpable as Ethan walked into the building one final time. A terse conversation with the receptionist confirmed that Darren had been in trouble, mentioning once again the ominous name Sullivan. Before leaving, she warned, "They're watching." Ethan nodded, silently vowing that he would no longer be intimidated. That night, as Ethan sat in his dark living room, his thoughts churned with plans for retaliation. Suddenly, he heard the distant rumble of a large truck approaching. This was not an ordinary vehicle, but a menacing sign that his adversaries were ready to escalate their efforts. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed his shotgun and stepped outside, prepared to defend his home at all costs. The truck revved its engine, tires screeching on the asphalt as it barreled toward his house. Ethan fired a single, resounding shot into the air, a warning shot that caused the truck to skid to a halt before retreating. Clutching his weapon, Ethan felt the adrenaline surge through him. They had tried to run him down, but he was ready for the next move. Not content to merely defend his territory, Ethan drove directly to City Hall. Although he lacked direct evidence of the ongoing threats, he possessed the critical document proving that Ellis Properties had already claimed his land through fraudulent means. Requesting every public record related to the company's recent projects, permits, zoning changes, and financial transactions, he spent hours combing through the records. Buried deep among the files, he found the damning document. A signed agreement granting Ellis Properties rights to develop on land that included his own. The realization that his property had been legally taken from him without his consent stoked his resolve. He made multiple copies and sent them to the local newspaper, sympathetic city council members, and his lawyer, ensuring that the truth could not be suppressed. By morning, the scandal exploded in the media. Reports detailed suspicious land deals, missing funds, and a massive real estate fraud implicating Sullivan's entire operation. As city officials scrambled to distance themselves, news spread that Sullivan was under investigation and his office had been raided. Within hours, the mastermind found himself in handcuffs. That evening, while Ethan sat on his porch, sipping a beer and watching the sun set over what remained of his once pristine hedge, Darren Ellis unexpectedly appeared. Bruised and limping, Darren's survival was a testament to his resilience. "You look terrible," Ethan remarked. Darren managed a weak chuckle. "You should have seen the other guy," he replied. Ethan gestured for him to come inside. Once seated, Darren explained, "I tried to take the deal, but Sullivan's men nearly finished me off. They left me for dead, but I pulled through." Ethan shook his head. "So why did you risk it all?" Darren's eyes flickered with a mixture of defiance and regret. "I knew you wouldn't accept their offer. I left those documents where I thought you'd find them, hoping you'd uncover the truth." Ethan's voice was even as he replied, "You used me, Darren. We're even now, but the fight isn't over." Darren leaned forward, wincing slightly. "Now? Now we finish this?" Ethan considered his next move carefully. "How on earth did you survive?" he asked. Darren smirked bitterly. "They grabbed me a week ago, took me to an abandoned lot, roughed me up, and put a gun to my head. They assumed I was dead because of my cracked skull. But I'm still here." Ethan scoffed. "You really thought I needed backup?" Darren grinned. "You were doing fine on your own." Ethan shook his head, acknowledging that while he had already borne the brunt of the assault, Darren's survival meant that Sullivan had not entirely won. "So what now?" Ethan asked. Darren replied, "We expose Sullivan. I know a guy, someone who can dig up the kind of dirt that will make even Sullivan tremble." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "And what kind of guy is that?" Darren simply smirked and said, "The kind you don't question." Though Ethan was uneasy with the vagueness, he had little choice but to agree. "Fine, but we do this my way from now on," he warned. Darren raised his hands in mock surrender. "Whatever you say, Carter." In the ensuing days, while the media hammered down on Sullivan and his fraudulent empire, Darren worked diligently behind the scenes. Their efforts eventually uncovered a bank account linked not directly to Sullivan, but to one of his shell companies. Millions of dollars funneled offshore through dummy corporations. This discovery was the final nail in the coffin. With the evidence in hand, the next morning the headlines blared. "Massive land fraud scandal, Sullivan under investigation." As city officials scrambled to extricate themselves from the fallout, Sullivan's office was raided, and he was swiftly taken into custody. That evening, as Ethan sat on his porch watching the last rays of sunlight dance over his battered hedge, Darren reappeared. This time not as an aggressor, but as an ally. Bruised yet determined, he greeted Ethan. "You look like hell, but you're still standing." Ethan smiled wryly. "So what now?" Darren replied, "Now I rebuild and make damn sure no one ever tries to take what's mine again." Ethan offered a smirk. "If you ever need help, don't even think about it." Darren chuckled, clinking his glass against Ethan's beer bottle before disappearing down the quiet street. Ethan watched him go, then turned back to his home, his land, and the legacy he had fought so hard to protect. It had cost him more than he ever expected, but through grit, determination, and a refusal to back down, he had reclaimed control of his property and his destiny, and that, in the end, was all that truly mattered.